I feel a lot of affection in this room, and therefore I know that means that you know Clifford, because the one follows the other. And if you know Clifford, you know that those hurricane waves, they didn't have a chance. And nor did I or MASMOCA. I just want to remind you, Clifford, that this exhibition began with a pretty simple idea that was brought to MASMOCA by, interestingly, our curator of performing arts, Rachel Chanoff, seconded by Jock Reynolds. The idea was very simple. It was going to be a couple of video projections in one of the courtyards of MASMOCA that would serve as a backdrop to a performance. And as an adjunct to that, we were going to do a small exhibition, laser focused, which would be up for a couple of months in the summer. So I thought, how we could, it's 4,000 square feet, 3 or 4 projectors, what's the big deal? Here's what we ended up with over the course of 18 months. The 4,000 square foot show became, in its first iteration, a 14,000 square foot exhibition, which involved one large photograph that measures 120 feet wide by 24 feet tall, printed on 90 sheets of plywood, the veneer for which was hand-picked and cut from trees that Clifford found someplace that met his specification. 14,000 square feet was a lot, but it wasn't enough. There was a building that hadn't been renovated yet at MASMOCA, one of several. So we renovated that building to make room for 2 interwoven exhibitions dealing with the hurricane subject matter, one group of 12 very large, beautifully printed black and white photographs, and a second set of computer-generated waves that Aggie spoke about that were beautiful. And you thought that that might have been enough, but it wasn't. The small courtyard installation of 3 projectors became a 2-acre immersive 12-screen video installation that we believe had more pixels on it than any single video ever done, including those out on Times Square right there. The one weekend of music turned into 16 performances over the course of the summer, 12 of which had beautifully rendered music, and 3 of which were live performances, 2 of which happened during our Solid Sound Festival that we do with a really great band named Wilco. The other one was a beautiful night of music with the St. Luke's Symphony Orchestra, which is fabulous. That's just to say that the exhibition that began as a simple video installation and show grew into something somewhat more complicated. A similar story could be told of this book, which grew into two books. And about the books, I just want to say a couple of things. First of all, we're delighted to have our co-publishers at MIT Press. They did a very beautiful job. Meridian, wow, great job printing. Most I'd like to say, Jay Clark's in the back. Jay's the Manton curator of photography at the Clark Art Institute. She's got a full-time job, and somehow she found time to corral not only Clifford, but also a really great group of writers. I will name them, Aggie, if you don't mind, because they're fabulous. David Anpham, Fong Bui, Arthur Danto through his estate, obviously, Jack Flam, Nicholas Negroponte, who is here from MIT Media Lab, Jock Reynolds from Yale, Orville Schell, and Quentin Bajac, who is going to join us now, and I would invite you both to come up and we can get this show on the road. Quentin, before coming to the Museum of Art, Quentin was an associate curator at the Musée d'Orsay and then went on to become the chief curator of photography at the Centre Pompidou. We're delighted to have him and his essay ensconced in this book. Clifford and Quentin will talk for about, I don't know, 30 minutes or so. At some point, I'll come interrupt you and invite questions, if that's okay. Clifford, thank you so much. Yeah.
My first question after that long introduction would be not to ask you who you are, because that would be a terrible question to ask anyone, but in a more simple way, how would you define yourself today?
In the last week, began to feel differently about who I am as an artist once I saw this second book land on my table. Working with Joe at Mass Mocha was an astounding experience. Some of my memories have a slightly different cant. I felt like it took two to do that tango. But I honestly feel shocked that I traveled all these distances. I had no intention of moving across so many media. I had no intention to work abstractly or realistically or cycle between. It was an organic process. And it was one driven, I think, and I see fellow artists in the room, and Ross and Clark and Jean and others and Seaton. I think artists basically are driven by curiosity. And I don't think we always come up with answers, but the curiosity sends us on a path. My path turned out to be much more complex than I could have ever imagined. And I didn't know how complex it was until, I think in full, until I started working with Joe and until we created this book together. I think I'm as surprised as you are.
I know you as a photographer, even if I would never call you a photographer, or as a multimedia artist. But in fact, you were a painter at first, and you were a painter for more than 20 years, in fact, in the 70s, 80s, and still early 90s. And starting with abstraction in the second half of the 70s. So I would like to slightly play devil's advocate. And you started with abstract painting in the mid-70s, around color field abstraction. Was there still a topicality of that kind of abstraction at that time?
Well, I thought so. I grew up in the middle of it. It was the natural course to take. It wasn't that I was passive, but my world was filled with abstraction and the history that came out of abstract expressionism. And with an aunt who certainly added a mark in that tradition. In a way, that natural path lasted. And I think I was painting honest paintings for 4 or 5 years, but within that realm. What happened to me is I ran into other art finally. I did a show in 1980 where the critic Clement Greenberg basically he assigned me a permanent position in hell in my aunt's kitchen, basically banishing me from his good graces and the good graces of anybody he would talk to. It was pretty traumatic. It's the fight with the father figure. And in a way, it was probably the thing that saved my life. I already had transgressed. But that pushed me off the edge, and I quit showing for 4 years and went back. Even though the main early thrust was abstraction, I knew Mondrian painted those chrysanthemums. I knew Pollock had followed Benton. And I felt if I didn't deal with the real world, I had no right to be abstracting it.
So you move away from abstraction. You begin to get very involved with what we could call representational imagery. And then you discover some currents of paintings that are very, very far distant from abstraction, including 19th century Hudson School painters that you already knew, of course, but that you really study in depth. Frederick Edwin Church, Albert Bierstadt, and also that other very different tradition that I was mentioning before, which is not a Western one, but an Eastern one, that of Chinese scroll painting. And yet you try, right from the start, to do a kind of synthesis of this kind of completely opposite tradition. So right from the start, there was for you, I think, a kind of position of doing a split.
Absolutely not. I mean, getting ready for this little talk, I mentioned that we had found a photograph from 1974. I had rented a for $50 a month, an abandoned dentist's office in New Haven. I was too shy to paint around other artists in art school. And there's a photograph of 3 panels of color. I was very in love with Bryce Marden's work at the time. And, you know, as a young artist, you always end up, you follow someone until you run out of room. And the flip into realism, the first big flip, which was 79, 80, it didn't happen because of the fight with Clem. It was happening anyway. I began to feel as if, and I adore, you know, not only abstract expressionism, but color field painting and Kenneth Nolan, Morris Louis. But it was as if I had been given an orange and most of the juice had already been squeezed out. And I was surrounded by artists, younger artists like myself, who clearly felt the orange was full of juice still. And, you know, I thought the only way out was to find out what the great abstract painters had been dealing with before they became great abstract painters. So it was a sort of a backwards logic, but I just, as we talk about this, I think about the subway paintings of Rothko. I mean, you know, all these guys, and in the case of Helen, these gals, they tangled with the real world. And I just felt compelled to do my homework. And then the homework became my joy. So it became a completely 50-50 dialectical experience that hasn't stopped.
In a way, I have 2 kind of contrary questions to ask. The first one would be, why photography? And in another way, what took you so long?
I am the last one to know why, but I know when I see something, it's like falling in love. You know, there it is. Between 85 and 94, I had forgotten I'd even used photography as a mechanism into those very expressionistic landscapes. So for years I've been saying, yeah, I started photography in 94. The moment when it happened in any public sense was that I was doing a show in 94, and my then dealer came into the studio and found hundreds of cut-out black and white contact prints. And he basically said, you know, what are these? And I said, nothing, they're my notes. And he promptly put 3 of them in a show with huge paintings. And I was pretty horrified. I thought the idea was idiotic. And then when I saw them up on the wall, the thing that was idiotic, relatively speaking, seemed to be the paintings. And I realized I was faced with something that had a voice I didn't think it did before. And I basically started to move into a depression because I figured I had no idea what I was doing. And the only way out of the depression was find out about photography. Once I began to find out, it was a complete love affair.
Who were the photographers that you were, in a way, interested in at that time? I'm talking about, that second half of the 90s, when you start really getting involved with photography.
I have 2 very particular memories in that period. One was I began to go to the galleries, and there was one gallery, and you know the history is beautiful, but one gallery that was particularly gracious about showing me work endlessly and answering my questions was Sonnabend. And I think I see Antonio and Jason here. And yeah, I used to go into the galleries, and I remember Jason and Antonio pulling out, you know, photos by Hiroshi or answering questions about Elgar Esser. So I became aware of what the current efforts were in the medium. I would walk up and admire Gursky's pictures. But as a guy that looked at paintings, whether it was a small Rembrandt or we were talking about huge Tintorettos, I would walk up to anything like that tapestry, and it reads from here, and it also reads from here, very close. And I felt there was something about photography that was wanting, that I wanted to put into it. And that was large-scale work that worked intimately. And for me, it translated essentially into, how do I get that huge mountain with all its details into a picture so that when you put your nose up near it, close enough that the guard at Mass Mocha tries to pull you away, which is really, for me, the ultimate compliment is when there's a nose print on the glass.
You know, getting closer and seeing details that you don't notice at first is exactly the experience of the first viewers of the first daguerreotype plates, you know, in the years 1839, 1840, that were just, you know, using that magnifying glasses and discovering details that you just could not see and that were there on the silver plates. So that's really the same experience, and which in fact relates you to that kind of realistic tradition of 19th century painting and of course photography. This is why in the essay I wrote, I compare you with Daguerre, because he's also a man interested in technique.
Certainly at the beginning, photography, the first word after photography would be camera for me. It's the decisive moment. When do you capture the real world? But very, very quickly, because I'm an analog person, I like working with my hands, I found that my body wanted to be doing something besides click. It wanted to be, you know, making a mess in the darkroom. And I remember really well a moment. There's something, you know, not everybody may, called pre-fogging, when you put some light on the paper to make it sensitive to highlights. And I'm sort of sloppy in a lot of ways with my art making, and it got out of control. And this was supposed to be a very pale, almost invisible gray. It was like a dark charcoal. And I was just mesmerized. I've loved Ed Reinhardt. I've loved Robert Ryman. And what I realized is photography actually was the portal for me, not to explore realism, which was the beginning logic, but a portal in both directions that fulfilled both my instincts. Complete accident that I would discover this. But once I discover something like that that feels right, every artist, every creative person in this room knows this feeling. You just run with it. And you run until you fall down, you pick up, and then you keep running. And, you know, I suppose I ran all the way to North Adams.
And another aspect of your work at that time is that you start more and more experimenting with different techniques and with technology, and with a highly sophisticated technology, and that you've kept experimenting in a way more and more with that highly sophisticated technology, designing with sometimes by yourself and often with other people, some cameras, that R1 camera, that very high resolution camera, or that R2 360-degree video camera, and also, you know, experimenting in many other ways. You know, we're seeing that huge image which is at MassMocha, printing on wood, which is also another way of experimenting. And that interest in technology, in experiment, is something which is really part of your work.
To me, technology has a cant to it that I'm not totally comfortable with, honestly. To me, it's about invention. I have a desire with invention to create things. It's not the invention per se. Invention is driven by my desire to show something to you or to anyone here. I would like to figure out how to deliver the experience I have with that mountain or that wave or being in that water to you by any means necessary. And a lot of the time, the means don't exist. So it becomes I wish somebody had given me the camera rather than building the camera.
So these means do not exist, and so you have to invent them. That also relates you to early photography, you know, all these pioneers of photography. I was mentioning Daguerre, but this time I should probably mention Talbot, you know, who was an inventor of processes, but also of forms. And those were both very, very closely connected. So you invent them, and then once you have invented, and once you have taken these very hyper-realistic images, you realize that this is not the real thing. You realize that photography has also its limits, and that they're not always truthful to your experience of nature and of nature sublime. And I would like also to talk about nature sublime and about your very strong relationship with nature.
Yeah, a friend of mine who, Hans Kraus, is like a drug dealer to me. He teaches me about the past and how I can't invent anything new. But, you know, in terms of this business of, you're bringing up Daguerre or Talbot, I do love art history, and I really did not know much about photography. But one of the seminal experiences, ironically, for me, in terms of how my work evolved, was through the inventive process of a 19th century photographer, not so well known, where I felt I had seen, I'm not sure Hans agrees with me, but there were some amazing paper negatives at the Met, one of the Taj Mahal by a guy named John Murray, exactly. And I took one look at this thing and I thought, never seen the Taj Mahal, but I believe it. And it was a black and white negative with all kinds of India ink painted on the sky. And I thought it was closer to like Jasper Johns or something, but I believed in the Taj Mahal. So what happened basically is it dynamited my mountain. And I started making paper in Japan. I drained all the color from my imagery. I turned it into a black and white negative and basically tried to mimic I sat one day with Hans and looked at 80 paper negatives, I think, of John Murray. 60, okay. And, you know, basically what happens, I think, when you make art is that shit happens. It's not that complicated. And you're right. You've identified, I'm obsessed with the sublime in nature. Whether it is nature itself or artists attempting to depict it, whether that artist is Barnett Newman or Pollock or James Ward. The sublime exists in Northern Sung landscape painting. It exists with James Ward. And I guess I'm trying to embrace and get near to the sublime all the time. And I'd like to share that high with anyone else that would care to look.
Yes.
On this topic, could I ask a question?
Of course. Please feel free to jump in.
Yeah. So it's a sentence that you wrote, Canton, in here that struck me. Here was a sentence. Nowadays, this illusionistic tradition in which Ross places himself is perceived as an inglorious aspect of 19th century culture, one rejected by a certain strain of modernity. That's kind of an elliptical phrasing, and it feels polite to me. So I'd like you to unpack that just a little bit.
No, I just wanted to put things in a very straightforward manner. So I just wanted to say that, you know, when Clifford starts getting interested in all that Frederick Edwin Church, Albert Bierstadt's tradition, that's something that all the modernists have had in horror for decades. And I find that interesting, you know, that you're looking in that other direction, that you try to reconcile things that were completely opposite for decades, and yet thinking that there's something in that direction that's a path that can be re-explored, and I think that's what artists are here for, you know. But yeah, that was, you know, in a way trying to look in something that had been not only overlooked but completely despised and rejected by where you were coming from. So that was, you know, you were talking about killing the father, but that was really killing the father and killing a part of a tradition that was definitely yours, and trying to go in that other direction and to try to in a way pursue that kind of great realist tradition. I was talking about integral realism, mentioning a Bazin article of 46 to try to identify what you were doing, but I have the feeling that a part of your work is really in that tradition of that realist and hyper-realist tradition, which is completely opposed to where you come from. So, and yet you try to work in these two directions at the same time. But before turning the mic to, I had one last question about nature and about, in fact, environmental issues. Because, as you know, we have a climate conference in Paris right now. And your work deals with nature, with nature sublime. And what do you think about these readings of your work? Are you opposed to that? Do you encourage them? Because, you know, it also relates to that tradition of Muybridge, of Watkins, of Ansel Adams, of how, you know, through photography, all these natural landscapes and especially Yosemite and all these places became familiar and then protected. So there were also environmental issues connected to these images.
I don't think about politics or climate change when I make my art at all. I make my art trying to find something that is outside of that. But it doesn't mean that my art can't either serve it or have a subtext which may even encompass it's what I think it's about. It turns out the hurricane waves, I thought I was capturing nature at its most sublime and natural. Photography can serve to draw attention to something. And you know, beauty is a nasty word in today's art world, generally. I think it has been for some time. And it's something which, well, I just reject it. I think beauty is very useful. I think that I've heard, mainly with the mountains, I've heard them be accused of being celebrations of nature's beauty in such a way as to deny, in a way, it's our environmental holocaust. All I can tell you is if you don't see what it is you want to save, where are you going to go? Art doesn't exist until the viewer looks at it. It exists for me. But you know, until each of you looks at that tapestry is not doing anything. And if you come to my work and feel more about a political or an environmental issue, as far as I'm concerned, God bless. My work is for you to interpret. It's not for me to dictate. I just make it.
I just make it. That's a good last sentence.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you, Clifford. Thank you, Quentin.